Well, firstly, Helen, thank you so much. I found that incredibly interesting, and I've got reams and reams of notes to go through a bit later. I just wanted to ask you, or just mention two things. We deliver modern apprenticeships in Scotland, and I feel that possibly we are a bit sort of primitive in how we look at RPL and reference it in, because in Scotland we are expected to really clearly show where that prior learning is coming through. So if they have sort of a personal license holder qualification, we have to really link very carefully and look at what they learned on that program before we're allowed to use it for RPL. So I feel maybe we're a bit primitive and behind in what we're doing here in Scotland compared to you.
Um, Thank you, Sarah. You're very kind. I don't know. I've over the years done a lot of work with Ruth Whitaker in particular when she was at Napier, I think. And I always thought you were ahead because you had your QAA guidance around RPL in Scotland and a more sort of developmental approach. And I think it's perhaps what you're describing is not so different to what many of us have experienced. That the idea of mapping and atomizing learning is quite a common concept. And again, I think it's, for me, it was useful to, a bit of a light bulb moment when, talking to participants and just making this distinction. Well, is this simply a transfer process? Do I need how much information do I need from this person to transfer their learning? Do I need to tick every box, or are there some key things that I need? What sort of evidence do I need? Is this a learning transfer? If it's something that needs translating, what do I need them to tell me about it? And how best can I frame that? So I think that you may not be behind, and many of us may be doing exactly what you're doing. But I think that in the RPL literature, there's been a lot of critique of learning outcomes. They are useful. Learning outcomes are useful hooks, perhaps, to help us to connect across different contexts. But they can mean, if you have a set of learning outcomes framing your program and they don't exist in the applicant's world, then you're silencing and making invisible perhaps a lot of valuable learning, or also perhaps you're making the process very burdensome. So it's thinking, I think, about learning outcomes, the value of them, what they might look like. What we do in the University of Hertfordshire practice is we think not just, we do have module learning outcomes, of course we do, and sometimes it might be appropriate for an individual to be mapping against a particular module learning outcome, but we also think about, for designing curriculum with more significant amounts of credit, what are the program level learning outcomes? What is the end point for the student? What are we saying at the end of a degree that students will be able to do or know? Because then we're thinking about prior learning as, where are they on that journey? Can they show how their learning relates to the end point? And program level learning outcomes are often broader and more encompassing when it comes to mapping prior learning. And I think it's just, for me, it's been interesting to think about articulating what I'm trying to do and to write that as a pedagogy or a process that I can explain to other people, not least of all the applicants themselves.
You might find also that sometimes people haven't done a lot of RPL, so they're fearful of
Yes.
taking those steps without some kind of guidance or clarity in what they need to do. So I suppose you
Absolutely. And I get that 100%. Nobody
yeah.
wants to let a student down. Nobody wants to take a student onto a program that they can't cope with. So it's very important to think about both the prior learning, the practice, and where the student is going. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of practice, RPL practice, is thought of in terms of the past and mapping the past, but we're also thinking about the future and going on to further study, as you'll be doing with your apprentices. So
Yeah.
part of our own practice is also building in concepts around criticality, thinking about shared concepts and the broader picture of the work context, and reading things and writing and different ways of expression in terms of academic writing,
Yeah.
and even
Absolutely.
referencing. So I think, there's, what we have is in the RPL process both a past, present, and future perspective.
Brilliant. The second one I just thought was really interesting, and I jotted a few notes down from your presentation, was the concept of assessment as learning. And actually, I experienced exactly what you were talking about yesterday with one of my hospitality management candidates up north, where we were talking about something that he had done in the workplace. And we had recorded the session, thank goodness, because at the end of the conversation, I had said to him, well, goodness me, all you need to now produce is some evidence from your workplace so that I can map this conversation, your work products, into the unit criteria, and
Mm,
literally you've completed that unit already. And it was all through what you were saying. I've done this before. I know exactly what you're talking about. Goodness me, I can't believe
yes.
that's so relevant. So I found that a really interesting bit of your presentation because it was so
and I
relevant to what we do.
And I think, Sarah, that anybody who's been in the RPL, APEL field for a while will just so connect with what you're saying, because all the time we just, suddenly they get the light bulb. Oh, that's what you're asking about. I do
Yes,
that all the time. Is that, yeah? Yeah, but that's what we want. So
gives them such
it is
confidence.
about
Yes,
the,
yeah,
yes. So, either sharing the concept or the practice, to get to that aha moment. And I think, you know, what you're doing is wonderful, because even that's on a one-to-one basis, it's a dialogic process. You're interested in
mm,
their practice as much as they're interested in what you want. It's this sharing and coming to a shared understanding of what it is we're looking for that's
yeah,
really valuable, I think, in APEL practice. To have something that's very monologic, that's the here's the handbook, go away, do it, come back to me, might work with some forms of learning. It might be, yeah, I get that, I know what you want, or I'll come and I'll show you how I do something. But very often I think, the dialogic process is really important in getting the sort of shared understanding about what it is that we're looking for when we're connecting those learning outcomes.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you very much. I found it very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Helen. Yeah, I just have a few questions that came up from the talk. There are so many questions and there's so many other issues to discuss. Hopefully we'll be able to carry on with these discussions. But the first one has to do with, somewhat connected, the role of the professional dialogue and the viva. So that's something perhaps that's different for people, that it used to be all a written process, didn't it? So
Yes.
maybe you could explain a little bit
Yes.
about those.
I think quite a few people now, my understanding, so I've picked up ideas from other people's practice. And I know my colleagues, Professor Digby Warren at London Met, for example, uses a lot of interview in terms of the APEL that he does. And I think in other areas of professional practice and work-based assessment, professional dialogues and assessed interviews have become more popular. And articulating your learning verbally is much easier than writing it down. So the first stage we have, there is the sort of, for the degree apprenticeships, there's the initial needs assessment process where we're looking at potential, looking at the standard, looking at the learning outcomes, and then we move into the formal APEL process. So that professional dialogue is mapped to SEEK level descriptors, and the SEEK level descriptors are really useful in pitching the level of your questions. And then we use the program learning outcome and the standard to think about the content. So that's assessed. So we have the same questions. We're very specific about the questions. Those interviews are written up and shared with the student or the apprentice, and they're part of their final portfolio. So they're a formal part of the process. They're assessed. by the final assessors and the external examiner. So that's part of the assessment process. The viva is what we are required by the university to do if we are giving more than 120 or 120 or more level 5 credits. So where we have an APEL process that takes people directly into level 6, into the final year, those students all have to have an individual viva where we're looking at, exploring their work and the authenticity and their general learning around that. And for students who are gaining less credits, fewer credits, we can ask them to come for a viva if we want clarification of something, if we're not sure about something, if we do have some questions about the authenticity of the work. So that's kind of the viva is part of the regulatory formal process. The assessment dialogue is part of our pedagogy for APEL.
Brilliant. Very, very, very useful. And this next question sort of relates to that in a way. A lot of people, when they think of RPL, APEL, they think of credits. And you've just mentioned that that's sort of into the scheme. It's one of the things that we need to think about when we're looking at RPL. What would you say about credits? How do they operate? Is that something that people, it kind of a key, you mentioned that sometimes there's the regulations there to do RPL, but there aren't a lot of practitioners doing it within institutions.
Yeah. So I think it's been very interesting thinking about the degree apprenticeship world, whether there is a mandated degree, postgraduate qualification, because you're really interlinking there the work, the learning from work and the credit. And increasingly, I think people are mapping the standard to the formal credits. And I think that's where perhaps we need to do some more thinking with policy bodies about, we're not just recognizing learning here and saying, okay, that we can shorten the time. We are talking about giving academic credit, and most universities will have very clear policy and regulatory guidelines for the award of credit. So here at the University of Hertfordshire, the maximum would be 75% of the undergraduate award can be awarded by APEL. And so we have the BA Leadership and Professional Development Programme. That's the maximum amount we could give, and the students then do a taught final year. On the CMDA programme, it's 50%. But so there are clear implications, I think, that perhaps haven't always been fully thought through yet, in terms of thinking about an initial needs assessment and the degree as part of the formal training program for an apprenticeship, and how we're linking those things together, because we're often giving credit as well as recognizing the skills, knowledges and behaviors in the training program.
Thank you. I think this is, as the integrated degree apprenticeship comes more to the fore, this is something that
absolutely, yeah, I agree.
I mean, it's one thing to have it, as we said, institutions have been working with these issues for a while, but we're in sort of a new world, and looking at those again and being aware of what those regulations are within one's institution.
Yes.
And then also looking externally. And you mentioned that really what we're doing as networks and as professional bodies is we're working together to now, find a way to come up to speed, I suppose, in the changing policy context. And that kind of has to do with the last question. It's kind of an open-ended one for you, but you mentioned the great worth of designing the pedagogy, and that your point of view is that it's not just a way of doing things, a mode. There has to be that thinking, that conceptualization for the journey that someone goes on. And I just wanted to open that up and just say, to have you talk about that. How can we, how can we
Mm.
now approach that and, fill in the gaps of our own, RPL pedagogy?
Mm. I think for me, it's sort of, listening to my own participants and doing the research work that I did, and the sort of actor network analysis I did for my doctorate, it made me really think about, actually, this is so important to, I've designed a process here, kind of thought it made sense to everybody who went through it, and then realizing people are conceptualizing that process differently. So for me, it's important to think about the nature of the learning and how that implicates, how that affects the design of the RPL process in terms of translational transfer, and how we're going to do that, and what sort of strategies we're going to use. Is it about articulation, demonstration, questions, concepts, the two together, or just the transfer? But thinking about it carefully ourselves, but also that, the point that Sarah made about the looking back and the looking forward, the thinking about, we're not, if we're giving significant amounts of credit and students are moving directly on to level 5 or level 6 of a program, we've also got to think about how we're preparing them for that as well, and building into our RPL pedagogies both learning and teaching tools that help us to facilitate the RPL process, but also that prepare students for the next stage of their work. And so that it isn't, I think sometimes RPL practice has been seen very much as about the individual and their own learning. And that can feel very overwhelming if somebody has just said, this is me and this is my learning. And for an assessor, that can feel completely overwhelming, and you're worried that you might give credit for this learning and the student might not do well. So I think, your whole design about then, where are the reference points for level and for relevance, and how am I going to design these in, and so that there is the external context. You're coming onto a leadership and professional development degree. So on the BA Leadership and Development Programme, the final piece of work the students do there for their RPL involves them looking at a whole range of leadership models and theories and applying them to themselves. So it's still reflective, but they are also looking at that wider context and preparation for moving on to the next stage of study. So I think it's really important to have these, as you would with any module. What is the pedagogy here? What am I trying to do? What am I trying to communicate? What are the learning outcomes? What are the, how am I aligning my pedagogic strategy to that? What am I trying to do here? And how am I sharing that with the students? Because there is some very interesting work that I read by a Swedish academic, I think Fredrik Sandberg, in which he was looking at a different sort of RPL pedagogy, which was with care support workers, which involved the assessors trying to make the process more straightforward for their students by having the whole thing by professional dialogue, and then the assessors making the connections to theories and to frameworks and to models. And so their intentions were to take some of the academic work that is unfamiliar, will not be in the background of the learners, and do that work themselves. And what he found when he talked to the students afterwards, when they'd got their credits, is that some of them were quite cynical about the process because they didn't understand what the pedagogy was, what was happening, why did I get the credits, and they weren't entirely trusting the process. And that has an implication then for how you feel about yourself as a learner. What we want is our learners to feel that they've been through a process that develops their identity as a learner. Knowledge is what I have. A learner is who I am, and therefore, we go on to further study with the confidence that that's appropriate for me. I've always felt that it's part of what we do in APEL is we give lots of messages about what you have to do and what we will accept and what we see as relevant. And it's a big ask for somebody to put themselves forward and say, I don't think I need to do 50% of your award or 2/3 of it, because I think, and that's, we need a process that is rigorous but welcoming, that is clear and comprehensible to the learners, so that they feel that it is appropriate for people like me. And I think that's all part, I think, of the design process.
Brilliant. I've got one more thing I just wanted to say. Sorry, Helen.
Yeah.
Everything you're saying is just making so much sense. As I said, I think it's a little bit different in some areas with Scotland and the modern apprenticeship side of it, but there's so much that you say that is so relevant as well. I think I probably am using RPL without even thinking about it as well, which is also quite interesting. But you mentioned during the presentation about your RPL through induction, using CVs, assessments, and all of that, and professional dialogue when you're interviewing them. And what's really interesting is we have a really comprehensive hour-long induction start paperwork process to sign up a modern apprenticeship. It is 1-to-1, and it's an hour of that time.
Wow.
And we get things like prior learning on our SQA website, and we look at CVs and have discussions with them. We look at what I think you call them foundation skills, we call them core skills. But we don't actually make sufficient use, like you were saying here, of that dialogue, because I feel that those bits of information and that professional discussion that we have at start, if we were really clever, we could map it into their qualification as well, which might be useful.
Absolutely, Sarah. I'm 100% with you. When we sat down and designed our process, initially it was outside of the apprenticeship system, because we weren't working in that framework at the time, but we were looking at and we're saying, well, we interview every student, we ask for this information, we ask for that information, how can we use that and make the process as streamlined as possible, so we're not interviewing and then calling them back to do something else, but we're saying, okay, so in preparation, we'll tell you what's going to happen in this interview, but this is actually part of the assessed process. So we ask you, so we have a handbook, and we're going to ask you to bring these things, and these are the types of questions we're going to ask. And as I say, I think I don't know if you're familiar with the SEEK level descriptors, but they're so helpful, because in helping you to frame questions and think about questions that are appropriate to the sort of level of the learner and the context they're working in, and the amount of autonomy they've got, the level of complexity they're working in. But we spend all this time with our learners, and I think you're absolutely right. We should be thinking about how can we incorporate that into our RPL pedagogy.
Yeah, brilliant. Really, really good. Just to confirm, I think your SEEK is actually the equivalent of our SEQF, where at every level they are, so it's
clearly
not
defined it,
overly...
and that's really helpful. I find that really helpful, because you can't ask a student to produce something at level 5. So we have to have a way of framing that. So we use the level descriptors to frame the tasks that we're asking the learners to do, and all of our processes then go through the usual validation process. So when we're validating a program, the RPL route is part of that validation program, and we can articulate and explain to the quality assurance panel how it is we're designing these tasks, what they do. And I think that's really useful.
Oh, I've got so many more questions, but I'm going to zip it for now. Thank you very much. That was so interesting.
Thank you very much, Helen and Sarah, for those questions. And we've tried to make a recording of this to have other people kind of join in on the conversation. And we're hoping to have a proper session in the autumn to have this go on with our network, our self-organizing network, with the work and learning. And so thank you so much. And I we'll be picking this up. And Helen, fantastic. Thank you for your question, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank
And,
you for
thanks,
inviting me,
Paula.
Paula, and thank you for your questions, Sarah, and for listening. Thank you.